Discussions at the moment are difficult, to say the least. It means that normally people throw something in the round, some topic, and normally the room escalates within a minute. If it's World Cup, if it's how players act, if it's what politicians do, whatever it is becoming more and more problematic. And when you have a culture of envy in your organization, that is deeply problematic for your whole organization, because it limits the productivity you have to a certain level. And of course, you need to deal with it and know how to handle it or to remove it. If we look into what's happening right now, we see that there are numerous arguments around where we have to talk either about envy culture or about what we say in Germany, Gratismut, which means, when you translate it word by word, the literal translation is free, as in free doesn't cost you anything. It's free, and courage, free courage. So it's a courage you don't pay for anything. And that is a good description of how the meaning of the word Gratismut actually works. And we're getting to that in a minute. When we're looking at the discussions right now, often people say we need to see a certain sign when people are at World Cup. And while I agree with this, we all know that this is not going to happen. But when you see a sign, they could have worn the One Love armband, but after FIFA told them that might get them a yellow card, they stopped doing that as well. But suddenly you have the German team. Of course, the Germans, because Germans love to be superior to others. I am German, so I'm allowed to say that. And they put their hands in front of their mouth as a sign of how FIFA censored them. And they say that's a form of protest. I have no idea who had that idea. That is a classic case of Gratismut, this free courage I talked about, and I will explain in a minute why this is the case. But there are other aspects. So, for example, in German culture at the moment, they talk about a politician, Robert Habeck, who is the secretary for the economy, and he just put a job ad out there. He's looking for a freelance photographer to travel with him for 2 years, and the pay is 350,000 euros. That's at least the budget, and people are absolutely mental about it. The discussion is, how can they spend so much money? And you see immediately they do not talk about the subject itself. It is only, why does someone have that and why do I not have that? So the question is how to handle these situations when you either face this Gratismut, this free courage, or even virtue signaling, which is even worse, or how to handle when you have a culture of envy in your organization. So first, when we talk about envy culture, let's take this example of the photographer. Someone is going to take photos of you, traveling with you for 2 years, 350,000 euros. That is probably about 300,000 pounds, probably about $370,000, $380,000. And that is, by the way, a completely normal pay. When you look at the amount of days, not even talking about work for editing or data protection issues or holding everything ready, etc., when you see how many days you have to spend there, it is a daily fee of less than 1,000 a day. I know what I pay for my annual shooting, and I pay way more than that. So when you think this is too much, you simply have no clue about the subject matter, because from the, let's say, 800 euros or whatever it is per day, when you do the numbers, someone has to pay taxes from that. Then, of course, the healthcare, then of course, have a living from it. And of course, they need to put their own pension fund together on the side. So it is a rather low pay. But again, the discussion moves away from the subject matter, because the right question to ask is: Does the secretary in the Federal Republic of Germany, who is responsible and accountable for the economy, does that person need a photographer to travel with him? And the answer is definitely not. As the secretary in that position, secretary for the economy, Federal Republic of Germany, you get enough pictures that you can work with. When we now look into the other aspect. So you want to set a sign, you say something is going wrong, and we want to make a statement out there that something went wrong. And setting a sign must include that you face a negative consequence from it. Otherwise, it's nothing else than, look at me, I am better than you. And that's exactly what the German team has done at World Cup. I'm not looking World Cup, I just saw it from the media, and I'm not watching any games, not a single one. I just give you a couple of examples of how real courage, bravery, how brave people look like who have the courage and might face tremendous consequences from it. So, for example, Iranian players did not sing the national anthem, which can have tremendous consequences for them at home, meaning their families can be persecuted, they can be persecuted. You don't know how they handle this case. And this is a very brave step. And this also shows that they support the people who are now on the brink or on the way of the next Iranian revolution. Maybe at least they want to overthrow the people who are in charge right now. When you look into, for example, Budweiser, they now want to sue FIFA over suddenly bowing down to Qatar, not selling alcohol. And of course, now they have these millions of hectoliters of beer somewhere in a storage room somewhere in Qatar. At least they said the people who win World Cup, they get all the beer for free, so they can have a nice drink afterwards. However, Budweiser, of course, knows once you sue FIFA, you probably won't have a foot into their door ever again for tournaments to come in the future. So they know there will be consequences. And it gets even more intense. When you look into the 1970s, 1980s, where people who won medals at the Olympics, black people who raised their fist today you would say Black Lives Matter, back in the days it was human rights, Black Panthers, they publicly supported them. Many of them didn't get sponsoring contracts. Many of them faced challenging times or massive problems in their career as a sports person. That is a brave step. But what Germany does, what the German team does, you put your hand in front of your mouth. You won't face any consequences from that, nowhere. That is Gratismut, free courage. It doesn't help anyone. You just try to look better than others, which is on the brink of being virtue signaling, where you simply say, I am better than you. And that is probably a truly German trait. And the people who just clicked on this podcast and listened to that now, I am German, so I am allowed to say that. So how to do it better? When you have, for example, a culture of envy, where people say, well, when I don't have it, no one else can have it, then, of course, you immediately need to know how to deal with it. So how to do it better? Step number one. Let's say you want to set a sign, something went wrong, and you want to show how to do it better. You want to show what your values are. You have to show these values, including in the areas where you might face negative consequences. That might mean that you lose a supplier. That might mean you have higher cost. That might mean that suddenly your profit is a bit lower than it was before. It might mean that you actually make a loss, as, for example, Adidas did when they chucked out Kanye West. And they chucked out Kanye West. They fired him for a reason due to his anti-Semitic remarks, facing a roughly $300 million loss on that fashion line right now. But they say values come first. And by the way, if you only want to talk about values when there is no consequence for you, I just remember you of the moment during the pandemic where suddenly all the people were clapping at the window. And when someone says, do you want to pay more taxes or more healthcare for carers being paid better? Suddenly people say, no, not really. That is virtue signaling, or that is at least this free courage, Gratismut, what I told you about before. As soon as leaders only show their values when they know there is no negative consequence ever, then they socially delegitimize themselves, which means that people will not follow you in the future. It also means, by the way, that people will, of course, know that you've done that, and they will call you out most likely. So when you say, we don't care about equal and human rights, but on June 1st, we're going to post a picture with a rainbow flag because, equal rights, and then please buy our stuff, that is not working. So that's step number one. Show the signs and the steps you want to do, even when you face negative consequences. Step number two, when you see problematic behavior, problematic attitudes, for example, the envy culture, address it internally and externally and do it immediately. Way too often during consultancy, I've seen that at the end of a certain project, someone says, oh, do you remember in March when we had this situation? And the people say, no, I don't remember. And of course they don't remember, or they don't want to remember. You have to address it immediately, because otherwise people will simply say, I don't know what you're talking about. And by the way, when you then see, and that's the next step, that when you then see that people double down on their behavior, or you see repeated misconduct, then you have to show consequences, no matter how good or valuable or important the person for your organization is. When you have an envy culture, by the way, you also need to check if the envy culture was provoked by yourself. So when you pay people minimum wage, when you underpay, when you have a location in a very expensive city, but people struggle to make ends meet, and with your payment, they definitely cannot make ends meet, so they have to work somewhere else, etc., etc., etc. Sometimes it's not envy culture, it is just you paying too low. And when people are in precarious situations, they, of course, do not want to see that leaders say, I'm walking all my way to the bank and you don't know how to put food on the table. And by the way, the worst of it all is when leaders say, oh, money isn't that important. Or leaders say, money doesn't make you happy. Well, no, money does not either. So we have to talk about envy culture, but we also have to look at, do leaders provoke this envy culture, or have they done so in the past? As soon as you see that there's envy culture, you have to implement countermeasures immediately with the discussions, telling people what's acceptable, what's not, ask for their motivation, find a solution together, or when you don't find a solution, act. And that means you have to make a decision. And the decision should not be, well, it's a difficult person, but we just keep him or her or that person because somehow the work is on an okay level. That does not work. And by the way, this envy culture does not only apply to money. It also applies to, for example, remote work. We have a number of leaders who say, well, I never had remote work, working from home. I can't possibly think how this works. So we are not going to have that. That is a typical envy attitude. Just because you didn't have an advantage of XYZ doesn't mean that others have to face the same bad situation you had to face as well. Just think of a bit more sustainability. People can have better work circumstances when we now see that the options are available. Very important also, to wrap this up, clear communication, crystal clear communication internally and externally about anything you have done, because just because you have done it doesn't mean that people know about it. So be clear, be precise, and communicate in any direction possible. And of course, at the end of this, there are now 4 steps you have to do or should listen to get this into your organization. So aspect number 1, I have to say thank you once more in the rankings. We now have 5 or 6 international rankings constantly with the English and the German podcast. So thank you very much for that. Step number 2, when you now say, hey, I have questions about this because we see it in my organization, can we have a chat? Yes, just drop me an email, nb@nb-networks.com, and then we have a chat. When, of course, you say, hey, it's very specific. We need someone for training, speaking, coaching, or consulting, mentoring, or project interim management situation we have here, or we have an event. Can you host it, or can you speak there? Yes, of course. But we can also just chat about what you want to know and the questions you have. nb@nb-networks.com. Just drop me an email and then we take it from there. Very important, because the question came up a couple of times last week. Of course, everything is confidential. That goes without saying. And when you now say, hey, I want more, that is the next step, step number 3. Please go to expert.nb-networks.com. Put your email address in there, because every Wednesday you receive an email then with an update of everything I published during that week, and it's free access to everything that is in there. When you find my content somewhere, most likely you have to pay for it. When you see that email every Wednesday morning, it's 100% content at free guarantee. Then you will be able to access anything at no charge. So go to expert.nb-networks.com and put your email address in there. Thank you very much for doing so. And at the end, step number 4, the last step, that is the most important step, of course, because you now have to apply what you heard in this podcast, because only when you apply what you heard, you will see the positive change that you want to see in your organization. I'm always there and happy to help you. Let me know if you need anything, and I'm happy to assist you in your plans. And now I wish you a great week. And at the end of this podcast, there's only one thing left for me to say. Thank you very much for your time.